Black Maid and her toddler find a billionaire buried alive. What follows is shocking. The sun had barely cracked the horizon when Amara Osei pulled her daughter onto her back and tied the worn fabric around them both. The same faded blue kanga her mother had given her before she crossed the border from Ghana into South Africa, before life had decided to test every last corner of her spirit. Zara, 3 years old and light as morning air, pressed her warm face against the back of Amara's neck and made a sound somewhere between a hum and a yawn. It was her language, a private, wordless conversation she had with her mother every single morning, a reminder that despite everything, despite the small room they shared in the servants' quarters, despite the calluses on Amara's hands and the permanent ache in her lower back, there was still something perfect in the world. And that something was 3 years old and smelled like shea butter and sleep. Amara worked as a domestic worker at the Khumalo estate, a sprawling property on the outskirts of Johannesburg, where the manicured lawns stretched so far you could lose yourself in them, and the hedges were trimmed into shapes that made you wonder what it felt like to have so much money you paid someone to make your plants look like animals. She had worked here for 2 years. She knew every room, every corner, every mood of the house. She knew that the gardener, old Solomon, left his wheelbarrow by the east gate. She knew that the estate manager, Mrs. Petersa, took her tea at exactly 7 and could not be spoken to before it. She knew the rhythm of this place like a second heartbeat. But she did not know the Khumalo son. Nobody really did. Lethabo Khumalo, 34 years old, billionaire, founder of 3 technology companies, and the only child of the late Reginald and Miriam Khumalo, was known mostly by reputation, and reputation in these parts was a complicated, borrowed thing. People called him brilliant. People called him cold. Business magazines called him visionary. His former colleagues called him relentless. His 2 ex-fiancées, in interviews that his lawyers had tried to suppress, called him emotionally unavailable, a man who knew the price of everything and the value of almost nothing human. He had returned to the estate 3 days ago. Amara knew this only because Mrs. Petersa had gone into a full-scale domestic operation, fresh linens, polished silver, a whole different energy in the house, like a storm was coming and everyone was quietly bracing. Amara had not seen him. She worked the early mornings and the afternoons. He was a ghost in a mansion. That Tuesday morning, Zara still tied to her back, Amara walked her usual route through the property, collecting stray cups left outside from the night before, checking the laundry lines, beginning the quiet rhythm of a working day. The estate's back garden was vast and largely unused, a wild section that Reginald Khumalo had once planned to develop into a vineyard before he died, and which had since been left to grow into something between beauty and neglect. Amara liked it. Zara liked it more. It was Zara who heard it first. The little girls had lifted from her mother's back. Her small hands tightened their grip on Amara's shoulders. She said a word, not a real word, more of a shape, the way toddlers sometimes name things before they have language for them. Then she said it again, louder, pointing one chubby finger toward the old stone embankment at the far edge of the garden, where the earth dipped low and a partially collapsed wall met the soil.
Mama, dear.
Amara almost didn't stop. She was tired. She still had the East Wing bathrooms to clean before 8 o'clock. The morning was cold in the way only Johannesburg winter mornings can be, sharp, sudden, indifferent. But Zara's finger did not waver. And then Amara heard it too. It was faint, devastatingly faint, like a sound that had already been screaming for hours and had run out of everything except the thinnest thread of itself. A knock.
Slow.
Deliberate. For counts and then nothing. Then again. For counts. Someone was knocking from inside the earth. Amara froze. Every rational thought told her she was imagining it. But Zara was not imagining it. Zara, who at 3 years old had no reason to invent horrors, was still pointing, still making that urgent, wordless sound that only mothers understand. Amara moved toward the embankment. The old wall had partially collapsed over what appeared to be a maintenance shaft, a concrete underground channel built for irrigation purposes, she would later learn, during the original construction of the estate. A rusted iron door lay mostly buried under a section of wall and a summer's worth of soil. It had clearly caved in recently. The earth around it was disturbed, raw and dark in a way that older settled ground never is. The knocking came again. 4 counts. A pause. 4 counts. Hello. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. Hello, is someone there? Silence. Then, something that was not quite a word but carried inside it every desperate human hope, a sound. A voice. Reduced to almost nothing. Amara set Zara down on the grass, looked her daughter in the eyes, and said, in Chui, "Stay right here. Right here, Zara. Don't move." Zara sat down with the gravity of someone who understood completely. Amara pressed her hands against the soil, then her shoulder against the rusted door. Then every ounce of her 28-year-old body, every hour of physical labor that had made her stronger than anyone in this mansion had ever paused to notice. The door gave. Not fully, not at first, but enough. Enough for the smell of enclosed air and copper-tinged darkness to rush out at her. Enough for a hand, a man's hand, bleeding at the knuckles from what must have been hours of that slow, desperate knock, to push through the gap. Amara grabbed it. She grabbed it the way you grab something that is about to disappear off the edge of a world, instinctive and total, and without any thought for what comes after. Behind her, Zara made a soft sound, not fear, but something closer to recognition, the way children sometimes respond to pain they've never experienced but somehow already understand. "I have you," Amara said. "I have you. You're not alone." The hand in hers tightened. And Lethabo Kumalo, billionaire, genius, cold and relentless and emotionally unavailable, held on to the hand of a woman he had never met, in a garden he had neglected, and wept. Getting him out took 40 minutes. 40 minutes that Amara would later describe as both the longest and most clarifying of her life, because in those 40 minutes, with the rusted door partially open and Lethabo's hand in hers, she understood something about human beings that no salary, no status, no biography could ever change. Stripped down to darkness and suffocation and the closing walls of mortality, every single one of us becomes just a person.
Just a body.
Just a heartbeat trying to continue. He could not push himself out. She understood this quickly. Whatever had happened, and she did not yet know the full story, he had been in that shaft long enough for dehydration and cold to rob his limbs of their cooperation. His grip on her hand was strong, fueled by pure adrenaline and terror, but when she told him to push with his legs, she felt the effort he made, and she felt it fail. She did not panic. Panic was a luxury she had learned early she could not afford. She let go of his hand, heard his sharp intake of breath at that, the fear that she was leaving, and said immediately, firmly, "I'm not going anywhere. I'm finding something to pull with." She looked at Zara. Zara had not moved an inch. Her daughter, 3 years old, sat on the cold grass watching with the solemn, ancient attention of someone bearing witness to something important. "Good girl," Amara said softly. Good girl." She found Solomon's wheelbarrow rope near the east gate, moved faster than she thought her body could across that frost-tipped grass, her breath making clouds in the cold air. She came back. She threaded the rope through the handle of the iron door and braced her feet against the embankment wall and pulled. The door screamed against its rusted hinges, the soil shifted, and the gap widened. "Can you move now?"
Try.
"Try for me." And because the human body will do things for a voice that it will not do for pain, for fear, or even for the instinct of survival alone, he moved. He dragged himself, inch by inch, out of the ground, into the light. Amara caught him as he cleared the door, and they both went down onto the grass together, his weight against hers, her arms around a man she did not know, her chin pressed to his filthy hair, both of them breathing hard in the cold morning silence of a garden that smelled like frost and soil and something new. He was in terrible shape. His face was cut, a deep gash above his right eyebrow where the wall had caught him during the collapse. His lips were cracked and pale from dehydration. His clothing, expensive even in ruin, was caked in earth. His hands, those billionaires' hands that had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions, were raw and bleeding from the hours of knocking. 4 counts at a time. Because he was an engineer at heart, Amara would learn later, and even in a collapsing darkness he had thought, a pattern is better than screaming. A pattern carries further. A pattern says I am still thinking. I have not given up. He was shaking. Not quietly. The kind of shaking that comes after prolonged terror. Deep, involuntary, the body finally releasing what the mind had been holding together through sheer will. He pressed his face against Amara's shoulder and shook, and she held him, and she said nothing, because some moments are too full for words, and she had always known that. And then Zara came. Nobody asked her to. Nobody directed her. She simply stood up from the grass where she had been sitting so perfectly still, walked the 3 steps to where they were, and placed her tiny hand against Lethabo's cheek. That was all. Just her small, warm palm against his cold, devastated face. Lethabo's shaking slowed. He turned his head and looked at the child with an expression that Amara, who was watching everything, who noticed things the way only people who have learned to read rooms and people and silences can notice them, would describe later as the look of a man seeing the world for the first time after a very long time of only looking at it.
Hi, Zara said.
Her vocabulary was selective and confident. She had assessed the situation and determined that a greeting was the right thing. Lethabo Kumalo, who had not cried in front of another human being since his mother's funeral 6 years ago, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob but carried the weight of both. "Hi," he whispered back. Amara called for help on the mobile phone she kept in her apron pocket, her most prized possession, a second-hand smartphone that connected her to her sister in Accra and served as her alarm clock and her lifeline. She called Mrs. Petersa. She explained calmly what had happened. She stayed on the grass and held the billionaire and let her 3-year-old daughter hold his face in her hand while they waited. In those waiting minutes, he told her fragments. He had gone out the night before, after midnight, insomnia, he said, and something in his voice suggested that insomnia was an old companion, not a recent one. He had been walking the back garden, which he had not visited since childhood. He had found the old irrigation shaft and, without thinking, pulled open the door, drawn by memory, some half-formed recollection of playing there as a boy. The wall had chosen that exact moment to release what time and neglect had been slowly weakening. It collapsed inward. He fell. The door had jammed above him. He had been there for 9 hours. He had knocked. 4 counts. Again and again, through the night, while the estate slept above him and no one heard. He had screamed until his voice gave out, then knocked some more. He had counted the knocks to stay sane, had forced himself to think in sequences and patterns and numbers, because he knew that if he let himself simply feel the situation, simply feel the weight of the earth above him and the darkness around him, and the very real possibility that this was how it ended, he would not survive it. 9 hours. In the dark. Alone. You kept count, Amara said. It was not a question. Yes. How many times did you knock? He was quiet for a moment. I lost count somewhere around the 3rd hour. But I didn't stop. Amara looked at his bleeding knuckles. No, she said softly. You didn't. She rewrapped the blue kanga around Zara and held her daughter close while they waited, and the sun came up fully over the Kumalo estate, flooding the wild garden in gold, and the 3 of them, a black maid, her toddler, and a billionaire who had just been returned from the earth, sat together in the warming light and did not speak, because everything that needed to be said first was being said in the oldest language human beings have: presence, warmth, and the refusal to let go. The paramedics arrived 11 minutes after Mrs. Petersa, which meant that by the time the ambulance crew came through the iron gates, the estate manager had already cycled through shock, practicality, and a fierce, barely contained disapproval that was pointed, though never quite stated aloud, at the fact that the young Kumalo heir was lying on the grass with his head in a maid's lap. Amara noticed. She always noticed. She moved back without being asked, without making it a thing, the way women in her position learn to occupy and vacate space, so smoothly that nobody has to feel uncomfortable about asking them to. She stood up, settled Zara on her hip, and stepped aside for the paramedics, who worked quickly and professionally, checking Lethabo's vitals, cleaning the head wound, establishing that despite everything, despite 9 hours of cold and dehydration, and a wound that would later require 6 stitches, he was, remarkably, stable. "Lucky," one of the paramedics said, with the blunt cheerfulness of someone accustomed to outcomes that were considerably less so.
Lucky.
Amara thought about that word while she watched them load Lethabo onto the stretcher. She thought about the particular geography of luck, how it almost always required someone else to be standing in exactly the right place, at exactly the right moment, paying exactly the right kind of attention. She thought about how many times in human history luck had depended entirely on someone nobody expected to be the one. Lethabo turned his head as they wheeled him past. His eyes found Amara in the way that eyes find things they're looking for, not things they happen across. "Wait," he said. The paramedic slowed. He looked at Amara. His voice was still raw and thin, scraped clean by 9 hours of shouting into the dark. "I don't know your name." "Amara," she said. He repeated it. Once, quietly, like he was committing it to somewhere important. Then he looked at Zara, who was watching him from her mother's hip with those calm, ancient eyes. "Is she yours?"
Yes.
"Her name is Zara." Something moved across his face, tender and complicated and quickly composed. "Thank you, Amara. Both of you." His eyes went back to the little girl. "Especially you." Zara, for her part, raised one hand and waved. Cheerful, complete, unbothered by any of the weight in the moment. They wheeled him away. Mrs. Peterson appeared at Amara's shoulder within seconds. She was not a cruel woman. Amara had long ago decided this, but she was a woman of profound order, for whom the world made sense primarily when things stayed in their designated positions. She told Amara that the morning's regular duties could be adjusted given the circumstances, but that the East Wing still needed attention before noon. She said it in the tone of someone offering generosity. Amara thanked her in the tone of someone who understood the transaction perfectly. She carried Zara to their room during the brief break between tasks, a small, clean room in the servants' block that she had made into something warm through sheer determination and a few personal touches. A photograph of her mother pinned above the bed, a tiny plastic giraffe that Zara dragged everywhere, a small speaker from which, every evening, she played the Ghanaian highlife music that made this foreign city feel temporarily like a place that recognized her. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, Zara in her lap, and let herself feel the morning. It moved through her in waves. The sound of that knocking, 4 counts, steady, human, refusing to surrender. The weight of his hand in hers through the gap in the door. Zara's palm against his cheek. The look on his face, that broken open, undefended look that she had seen on her mother's face once, at her father's graveside. The look of someone who had just understood at a cellular level that life was not guaranteed, not promised, not anything except possible. She thought about her own life, the path that had carried her here, to this room, to this estate. The death of her husband Kofi when Zara was 8 months old. The months of grief so total it had physical dimensions, a weight she carried in her chest that made breathing feel like an achievement. The decision to leave Accra, to follow her cousin to Johannesburg, to take whatever work was available, which was this work, domestic work, invisible and essential and perpetually undervalued. She thought about how she had learned, in the years since Kofi, to shrink herself. Not with bitterness. She had fought hard against bitterness, but with pragmatism. She had learned to become less visible in rooms where her visibility made others uncomfortable. She had learned to hold her intelligence quietly, like something kept in a closed hand. She had learned to answer to the maid and girl, and occasionally to nothing at all, to be addressed through instruction rather than interaction, as though she were an extension of the household rather than a human being moving temporarily through it. She did not resent the people who did this. She understood that invisibility was a thing that certain social architectures constructed, not always maliciously but architecturally, as reliably as weight-bearing walls. You lived inside those architectures and you breathed them, and they became, eventually, the air. She just sometimes forgot, in that air, that she was someone. Zara touched her face. Her daughter, 3 years old, who had sat perfectly still on cold grass because her mother asked her to, who had walked 3 steps and placed her hand on a stranger's cheek because she could see he needed it, who moved through this world with a certainty about her own worth that Amara did not yet fully understand how to protect, but was absolutely committed to. "We helped someone today," Amara said in Chui. Zara considered this with great seriousness. "The man in the ground," she confirmed. "Yes."
He was sad.
"He was scared, baby." Zara thought about this distinction. "Same," she said finally. Amara held her daughter tighter and pressed her nose into her hair, and breathed, and decided that whatever came next, because something was coming next, she could feel it in the changed texture of the morning, in the way the day had already turned off its ordinary road. She would face it as herself. Fully. Without apology. Because she had gone toward the knocking when many people, perhaps most, would have found a reason to keep walking. That was who she was. She wanted Zara to always know that was who they were. Lethabo was discharged from the hospital 48 hours later. 6 stitches above the right eyebrow. Mild dehydration, treated and resolved. A bruised rib from the initial fall. And something the attending physician mentioned almost as an afterthought, something about an elevated heart rate and the indicators of acute stress response and the recommendation, gently offered, of speaking to someone. Lethabo Kumalo had not spoken to anyone, not meaningfully, not about anything that actually mattered, in 6 years. He returned to the estate on a Thursday morning, moving through the house with the careful stiffness of someone who had recently been reminded of their own body. Mrs. Petersa had prepared his preferred breakfast. His personal assistant had called 14 times during his hospitalization and left messages that were professionally sympathetic and subtly panicked in equal measure. His board members had sent a collective email that was constructed, he noted, entirely around the question of when he would be available for the quarterly meeting, with wellness concerns distributed at tasteful intervals throughout as though decorating a functional document. He ate breakfast alone, as always. He looked out the window at the back garden, as he had not allowed himself to do. He thought about 9 hours in the dark. He had not told anyone, not the doctors, not Mrs. Petersa, not his assistant, what those 9 hours had actually been. The accounting of what the darkness does to a person who has already been living in a private kind of darkness for years. Because that was the truth that the cave-in had cracked open in him, the truth that the 9 hours underground had simply made literal what had been metaphorical for a long time. He had been buried alive before. Only slowly. Only in the way that men who are called relentless and visionary and emotionally unavailable sometimes are. He had lost his mother at 28. He had responded by working 16-hour days, 100-hour weeks, the construction of empires as an architecture of avoidance. He had lost 2 women who had loved him, not to circumstance, but to his own inability to be present, to be soft, to allow anyone past the carefully engineered barriers of competence and distance and control. He had inherited an estate and filled it with staff and left it as empty as he found it, because the only person who had ever made it feel like a home was buried in West Park Cemetery, and he had not been back to visit since the funeral. He had been dying by increments, very expensively, very efficiently, and then the earth had closed over him, and a woman he did not know had grabbed his hand through the dark, and a child had pressed her face against his cheek, and something in him had cracked open that was not a rib. He asked Mrs. Petersa at 9:30 on a Thursday morning where Amara was. Mrs. Petersa paused in a way that communicated, without a syllable, her awareness that this was unusual. She said that Amara would be in the East Wing at this time, and that she typically took her break at 10 with Zara in the small garden outside the servants' quarters. He thanked her and went back to looking out the window. At 10 o'clock, he walked to the small garden outside the servants' quarters. Amara was there. She was sitting on the single wooden bench in the small garden, Zara in her lap, reading a battered paperback. The child was eating a mandarin orange with the focused, surgical concentration that toddlers bring to food they love. She was wearing a tiny yellow dress that was slightly too big for her. She had her mother's eyes. Amara looked up. Her face did something complex and quickly composed, the expression of someone calibrating a situation that did not fit any established category. She began to stand. "Mr. Kumalo." "Please don't," he said. "Please don't get up." He gestured at the bench and then, since it was the only seating available, asked, formally and carefully, whether he might sit. She moved over. He sat. Zara looked at him for a long moment, mandarin orange suspended halfway to her mouth. Then she held it out to him. He took a segment. "Thank you," he said. "Welcome," she said, and returned to eating with the dignity of someone who had done a generous thing and felt no need to make more of it. They sat in silence for a moment. Amara waited. She had learned that waiting was not submission. It was information gathering. It was the patience of someone who understood that the first words a person said often told you less than the words they took time to find. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said. "Not the way I did on the stretcher. Properly." "You already thanked me," she said. "Not properly." She looked at him. He was different than she'd imagined a billionaire would be, sitting here on a wooden bench outside the servants' quarters in jeans and a plain sweater, the 6 stitches above his brow giving him a humanizing vulnerability that no magazine photograph had ever suggested. He looked like someone in the early stages of becoming a different version of himself. The process did not look comfortable. "How are you feeling?" she asked. He considered this with an honesty she had not expected. "Profoundly embarrassed," he said. "Which I've been told is actually progress." A pause. "And something else. Something I don't have an adequate word for yet." "What does it feel like?" He thought about it. "Like a house with all the windows open," he said finally. After a very long time close, Amara understood this completely. She didn't say so immediately. She sat with it, and he sat with it, and between them Zara finished her orange and began an investigation of a beetle that had appeared near her foot. "I've been asking Mrs. Peters about you," he said, and then immediately, accurately, read the way her body changed. Not intrusively. I realized I didn't know anything about the woman who saved my life, and that seemed like something I should correct." "What did she tell you?" "That you've worked here 2 years. That you're hardworking and reliable." A pause, and something that might have been carefully restrained anger. "That you're very good with the difficult rooms." Amara almost smiled. "That's accurate." "She didn't tell me about your husband," he said quietly. The morning went still. "She wouldn't know about that," Amara said. "I don't talk about Kofi here." "I'm sorry. About your loss." She looked at her daughter, who had lost interest in the beetle and was now examining her own feet with the intense philosophical curiosity of the very young. "She was 8 months old," Amara said. "She doesn't remember him. But sometimes I watch her, and I see him so clearly." She stopped. "I don't know why I'm telling you this." "Maybe," he said carefully, "because I'm actually listening." She looked at him. He met it, held the look without defense or deflection, which was, she was learning, not as natural to him as it appeared right now, but which he was choosing with visible intention. Zara climbed off the bench, walked 3 steps, and sat down firmly in the patch of sunlight on the path, apparently having decided to become one with it. "She does that,"
Amara said.
Finds the sun.
She found me, he said.
They both watched the little girl sit in her square of sunlight, face tilted upward, eyes closed, perfectly content. What was your mother like? Amara asked. The question surprised him. She could see it, the small flinch of someone unaccustomed to being asked what they needed rather than what they required. Then, slowly, painfully, beautifully, he began to answer. It started with Tuesday afternoons. He asked, the following week, whether Amara would object to him joining her break again. He framed it awkwardly, with the over-formality of someone who had forgotten how to ask for simple things and kept defaulting to the vocabulary of negotiation. She said yes, she would not object, and she said it with the steadiness of someone who had decided to see what this was before deciding what it meant. Zara had no such ambivalence. The next Tuesday, when Lethabo appeared at the small garden, she looked up from whatever she was doing, said, "Man," walked over, and handed him a plastic giraffe. He received it with the seriousness it deserved. He sat. She climbed onto the bench beside him without invitation and pressed her side against his arm and returned to her own small business, having apparently decided through whatever 3-year-old calculus governed these things, that he was acceptable.
He came back the Tuesday after that.
And the one after that. They talked. Slowly at first, the careful, structural conversation of two people learning the geography of each other without knowing yet what kind of territory they were mapping. He talked about the company he had built, but not the way he talked about it in interviews. Not the narrative of triumph and innovation, but the underside, the years of doubt, the decisions he regretted, the moment he realized he had confused achievement with living. She talked about Ghana, about her mother's cooking and the particular quality of Accra afternoons, and the way Kofi used to laugh, with his whole body, like laughter was something he was entirely unafraid to be consumed by. She told him that she had spent most of the last 2 years making herself smaller. He told her that he had spent most of the last 6 years making himself harder. We've both been surviving, she said. Yes. That's not the same as living. I know that now, he said. I learned it 9 hours at a time in a hole in your garden. And then one Tuesday in the 5th week, she told him something that she had not told anyone, that she had almost not stopped. That she had been tired and cold, and Zara was on her back, and there had been a moment, just a moment, when the pragmatic, exhausted part of her had taken one more step toward the house before the knock came again. 4 counts. She had stopped because the knock had pattern, and because she had decided, years ago, standing at Kofi's graveside in the hard Accra sun with an 8-month-old baby girl on her back, that she would always go toward the thing that needed her, regardless of what it cost. Lethabo listened to this, with his whole body still. Then he said, "You gave me back my life."
Zara found you, she said.
I just opened the door. You held my hand through the dark, he said. For 40 minutes. You didn't let go. She looked at him. I don't let go of things that matter. The air between them changed. It had been changing for 5 weeks, slowly, the way weather changes, imperceptible moment to moment, undeniable in aggregate. She saw it in his eyes, the thing that had been building and that he was not yet sure he had the right to. This man who was 34 and brilliant and had grown rich on the currency of certainty, but who was here, on a wooden bench outside the servants' quarters, being changed by the simplest things, a woman's voice in the dark, a child's warmth, the courage to be completely undone. I want to be honest with you, he said. You have been, she said. Not about this. He looked at his hands, those knuckles, still faintly scarred from the knocking. I don't know what this is. I'm not good at this. I have a documented history of being not good at this. He said it without self-pity, with the flat precision of a man assessing his own architectural failings. But I know that I think about your laugh. I know that Zara made me feel, for the first time in years, like the world was not a system to be managed but a place to be in. I know that I've been looking forward to Tuesdays more than I've looked forward to anything in a very long time. He paused. And I know that I have no framework for how to do whatever this is appropriately, given who I am and where you work and how careful we need to be, and I know that the power imbalance alone is.
Lethabo, she said. He stopped.
I know all of that, she said. I've been thinking about it too. All of it. Every implication. A pause. But I also know that a man who counts to 4 in the dark, so he doesn't lose his mind, is a man worth being honest with. So I'll be honest. She looked at him, direct and clear, in the way that had become her signature, this quality of attention that felt like being genuinely seen. I feel it too. Zara, who had been lying in her patch of sunlight, rolled over, looked at them both, and announced, "Hungry." They both laughed, sudden, full, releasing something that had been held carefully, and the laugh was the best thing. Laughter at exactly the right moment, the universe's perfect punctuation. He learned to help in the kitchen. He was catastrophic at it. This, at least, was democratizing, the competence that served him so well in boardrooms entirely absent before a cutting board, and Amara taught him, and Zara stood on a step stool and supervised with a seriousness that suggested she found their both incompetence equally troubling. He told his board he was taking a month's leave. The 14 calls personal assistant nearly resigned. He didn't. He began visiting his mother's grave. He sat with the estate's old gardener, Solomon, for 2 hours one afternoon and listened to him talk about the garden, what it had been, what it could be again. He hired 3 additional domestic staff, unprompted, because Amara had once said quietly that 4 people were doing the work of 8, and he had heard her. He made mistakes. He had the instinct sometimes to solve things, to offer money or resources when what was needed was presence, to move efficiently when what was required was stillness. Amara told him, directly and without cruelty, when this was happening. He was learning to hear it. The learning was visible, effortful, and real. Zara's plastic giraffe had taken up permanent residence on his desk. Spring came to the Kumalo estate the way it always comes to places that have been through difficulty, not triumphantly, not all at once, but in small merciful increments. The first warmth in the afternoon air, the overnight arrival of something green along the old embankment wall, the return of birds whose names Solomon knew and recited with the reverence of someone maintaining an important register. The old irrigation shaft had been safely sealed and the collapsed wall rebuilt. Lethabo had overseen this himself, had been present for every hour of it, which surprised the construction crew and did not surprise Amara. She understood that he needed to watch the ceiling. She understood that some things you have to witness closing before you can believe they're closed. It was a Saturday in September when he asked her to walk with him in the back garden. She came with Zara, naturally, because Zara and she were a complete sentence. He had understood this from the beginning, had never, in all the weeks of Tuesdays and kitchen disasters and long conversations on the bench, suggested by word or implication that the child was a complication. Zara had at some point begun calling him Beau, which was not a name but was somehow perfect, the way toddler-given names always are, drawn from some private logic that adults cannot access but can only be honored by. The back garden had changed. Solomon and a new crew had been working on it for 2 months, quietly, restoring what had been left to its intended wildness, clearing the overgrowth, replanting the beds that Reginald Kumalo had laid out decades ago, re-establishing the paths. It was not finished, but it was undeniably beginning. They walked to the far embankment. The spot was marked now, not dramatically, not with anything that called attention to itself. Just a small stone bench, newly placed, facing west so that in the late afternoon it received the full falling sun. Lethabo had placed it himself. He had not told Amara about it until now. She stood before it and read the small inscription on its base. It was in 3 languages, English, Twi, and Zulu. It said, simply, for the ones who go toward the knocking. She stood very still for a long moment. Zara, who had been conducting a serious investigation of a nearby rosebush, appeared at her mother's side as if summoned and pressed against her leg, which was her way of saying, "I'm here, and you're not alone," which had always been Zara's primary communication because she had been learning it from her mother since birth.
Lethabo, Amara said. Her voice was careful with something.
I know it's a garden bench, he said. I know it's not. I know it's not the right thing, necessarily, for everything I want to say. But I wanted to start here. In this place. Because this is where everything actually started. He was standing beside her, looking at the inscription, and she could feel the effort in him. The man who counted to 4 in the dark, applying that same counted, deliberate approach to saying the thing he meant. You found me at my most reduced. Not my most impressive, or my most successful, or my most anything that I've spent years constructing. Just me, in the dark, counting to stay sane. And you held on. And you have kept holding on. Even when I was clumsy. Even when I solved, when I should have listened. Even when I had no idea what I was doing. He looked at her then. I have been learning, he said, what it means to stay. I have been learning it from you and from this child, and from Tuesday afternoons, and from the way you talk about Kofi with love and without performance, and from every single small thing that I missed for 6 years because I was too busy building walls and calling them achievements. He reached into his jacket and brought out something small, not a ring, not yet, nothing so categorized and certain. It was a small carved wooden giraffe, identical to Zara's plastic one, but made with care, made by hand, made by Solomon's nephew, who carved things. This is not a proposal, he said, with the careful accuracy of a man who had thought deeply about what a proposal meant and was not going to use the word without earning it. This is a promise. That I am staying. That I am learning. That whatever we build, at whatever pace you set, in whatever form you say is right, I want to build it with honesty and with you. He paused. Both of you. Zara, on cue. The universe had been using her as its perfect punctuation since the very beginning, reached up and took the wooden giraffe. She examined it with the critical professionalism she brought to all assessments. Then she handed it to Amara. Amara held it. She turned it in her hands. She looked at the man beside her. This man who had been underground and come back. This man who was trying so earnestly to rebuild himself from the architecture of something more honest. And she felt the full weight of her own life. The grief, the crossing, the years of invisible labor. The small room with a photograph and the music from home. The daughter who found the sun. The morning that changed everything. She had gone toward the knocking. And the knocking had led here. You understand, she said quietly, that I am not a chapter in your transformation story. I am not the event that teaches the rich man his lesson. I am a person. My daughter is a person. And we come with history and complexity and you are the most complete human being I have ever known, he said. And I know that the power imbalance is real, and that we will have to navigate it deliberately, and that this estate, and this job, and all of it needs to change regardless of anything else between us, because you should never have been invisible here. He said it directly, without defense. I know all of that. I am not asking you to forget it. I'm asking you to let me prove over time, your pace, that I understand what actually matters. The sun was going down behind the western edge of the estate, catching the new roses along the embankment in its last warm gold, and the air smelled like spring and turned earth and something opening. Zara walked to the stone bench and climbed up and sat in the last patch of sun, face tilted upward, eyes closed. She had been doing this since she could walk, finding the warmth, settling into it, claiming it with the full confidence of someone who had never been told she didn't deserve it. Amara watched her daughter. She thought about knocking. 4 counts. The discipline of refusing to stop. The way pattern kept you sane when everything else was dark. She thought about a hand in hers through the dark. The way holding on felt nothing like control, nothing like certainty, but like the truest and most basic human thing. I am here. You're here. We're still here. She set the wooden giraffe carefully on the bench beside her daughter. She took Lethabo's hand. Not dramatically. Not as a declaration. The way you take a hand when you've decided to walk in the same direction, simply and with the full intention of continuing. He looked down at their joined hands. She felt him exhale, the long, held, architectural exhale of a man who has been holding something very tightly for a very long time. "Where do we go from here?" he asked. She looked at Zara, golden in the last light, at the garden that was becoming itself again, at the bench with its inscription in 3 languages, at the sky above the Kumalo estate deepening from blue to the first early purple of evening.
"Forward," she said.
Carefully, honestly. She looked at him.
"Together."
Zara opened her eyes, looked at them both with the magnificent certainty of someone for whom the world had always been, and would always be, a place worth being in. "Beau," she announced, extending one hand toward him. He came and sat on her other side. And there, on a stone bench in a garden that had been neglected and was now carefully, patiently, being returned to life, a black maid, her 3-year-old daughter, and a billionaire who had been underground and come back sat together as the sun went down, 3 people at the beginning of something true, bound not by circumstance or transaction or the comfortable architecture of the world they'd been handed, but by the oldest and most irrevocable thing. The choice to go toward the knocking. The choice to hold on. The choice, again and again, to stay.